Welcome, everyone, to Chapter 4 of Strategic Management of Healthcare Organizations. In this particular chapter, we're going to focus on internal environmental analysis and competitive advantage. But before we do that, let's take a look at the devotion for this particular chapter. And that is from 1 Corinthians 10:12. And what does it say? It tells us, therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. What does that mean? That means essentially that we need to look at ourselves from an internal perspective. Let us take heed. Let us look internally as we attempt to engage not only in terms of our professional work, but certainly from a personal perspective. Let's dig deep, let's look inside of ourselves and certainly take heed lest we fall. So this is again the crux, or shall we say the undercurrent of this particular chapter: internal environmental analysis and competitive advantage. And when we really think about it, at the end of the day, when we develop a strategy, what does that entail? It really entails looking at the external environment. And by the external environment, what we're really saying is, what should we do? And we've just done that with Chapter 3. We've made an assessment of the external environment. We've gone through the exercise of performing a SWOT analysis to understand what we should do. So we take what we should do from the external environment, and we perform an internal environment analysis, which really boils down to what we can do. And what that does, together with the external environment, is brings us to the point where we can develop a strategy for the organization. And that essentially means that we are now almost on the verge of a thorough analysis, because we've done the external, now we're doing the internal. Now, where does that put us in terms of strategic planning process? Essentially, like as we said, it's really the internal analysis here. And what does the internal analysis mean? What does it entail on the most part? It really asks a couple of very important questions. What should we do, and what can we do? It facilitates the identification of strengths, which is the competitive advantages we have as a health service organizations, and certainly the disadvantages or weaknesses we have as an organization. Now, where do those come from? They essentially come from the healthcare value chain. And what is that? If you really dig deep and if you look at the healthcare value chain, it really has two levels or two general strata, so to speak. One is the service delivery level, and the other is the support activity level. And if we take a really close look to dissect those two levels, we can break them up and say, let's first take a look at the first level, or the top level, which is the service delivery. And what does that entail? That essentially entails really the pre-service aspects of healthcare delivery. It involves the point of service aspects of healthcare delivery. It involves the after service aspects of healthcare delivery. And those, of course, can be broken down to further detail, which you will find in your texts. Now, let's move on to the second level, which is essentially the supportive activities, the support activities, which again really boil down to three main areas that add value: the organizational culture, the organizational structure, and certainly the strategic resources. And what do those entail? From an organizational culture, we're really talking about shared assumptions. We talk about shared values. We talk about behavioral norms. From an organizational structure, what are we talking about? We're talking about function. We're talking about division. We're talking about matrix, reporting matrix, or matrices for that matter. From a strategic resource perspective, we're talking about financial, human, information, technology perspectives. And so these are all critical along with the first layer in terms of delivering value from a healthcare perspective. Now, it's also very important to keep in mind how we, in fact, go about identifying current and potential competitive advantage. And that can essentially be broken down into three tiers: resources, competencies, and capabilities. And to get to that point, to get to the point where we really are able to identify these competitive advantages, we obviously have to engage in strategic thinking. And how do we do that? We basically develop a strategic thinking map. And that basically entails three basic tiers. The strategic thinking map, in terms of step one, or phase one, so to speak, involves looking at pre-service, point of service, and after service. And what does that mean? That means really looking at those areas based on culture, based on structure, based on strategic resources. And all those things basically essentially contribute to service delivery strengths and weaknesses, the support activity strengths and weaknesses as well. Strategic thinking map tier 2 or level 2 or step 2, whatever you want to refer to it in terms of the second level, really looks at evaluating competitive relevance of strengths and weaknesses from the perspective of value, from the perspective of rarity, from the perspective of being imitable, and from the perspective of being sustainable. And what do those do? Those in turn just basically feed into competitively relevant strengths and certainly help us identify competitive relevant weaknesses. And now, what are those things? When we talk about competitive advantage, competitive disadvantage, which really leads to strategic thinking, phase 3, so to speak, or step 3, or tier 3, what are those? What are the competitive advantages? What are the competitive disadvantages? Typically, there are some sources of competitive advantage, and they fall into two categories, which are basically your tangible and your intangible competitive advantages. And when we look at tangible competitive advantages, they could fall in the areas of financial holdings or backing, desirable location, state-of-the-art facilities or equipment or technology, difficulty in obtaining information, or ease for that matter of obtaining information. So that would be essentially more your tangible sources of competitive advantage, whereas your intangible sources of competitive advantage could be intellectual property, it could be reputation, it could be goodwill, there could be strong leadership and competent management, there could be essentially positive organizational culture. And again, when the key is to understand this process of strategic thinking. What strengths can be considered competitive advantage? There's multiple strengths that can be considered competitive advantage. Again, it's a question of dissecting those strengths based on whether the value of the strength is high or whether it's low, whether it's rare or whether it's not, whether the strength is easy or difficult to basically initiate, whether the strength is sustainable, can be sustained, and certainly what the implications are of that. And then the other element in terms of strategic thinking is really understanding what our weaknesses are as a health service organization. What weaknesses can be considered competitive disadvantages? And again, we're also looking at these from the perspective of, is the weakness high? Is it low? Is the weakness common? In other words, is it very pervasive amongst most healthcare service organizations or amongst competitors? Is the weakness easy or difficult to fix? Can competitors sustain their advantage? So these are all critical factors to think about in terms of basically strategic or what you might consider competitive advantages and competitive disadvantages. And then as we really assess this information, we've got to go through the process again of evaluating these internal strategic assumptions, just like we did on the external side. And what are the key considerations that we want to look at in terms of examining these internal strategic assumptions? One, we may want to ask ourselves, have the strengths and weaknesses been correctly identified? 2, is there a clear basis on which to compete? 3, does the strategy exploit the strengths and avoid the major weaknesses of the health service organization? 4, are the competitive advantages related to critical success factors in the service area? 5, have we provided our short and long-term competitive advantages? 6, has the competitive mode has the competition essentially made strategic moves or taken strategic actions that have weakened basically our health service organization's advantages? And are we creating new competitive advantages? So in order to really get a strong feel for this process, this internal assessment, the assignment that we have for you, it basically looks at a long-term care facility presented in several slides that you will see. We'll ask you to determine the competitive advantages, the competitive disadvantages by completing the determining competitive disadvantage tables. And certainly in a separate table of your own, you'll be able to provide your conclusions and rationale as to why you think those specific factors are competitive advantages or competitive disadvantages. Now, I will say it is important to recognize that in identifying both your competitive advantage, it's very important to recognize what questions you need to ask yourself about your strengths, what questions you need to ask yourself about your weaknesses. For example, for strengths, can we build a competitive advantage based on a particular strength? If we have a strength that's valuable or rare in the service area or difficult to maintain and one that we can sustain, then this factor may provide a competitive advantage. Lack of value, rareness in the industry, or those strengths that are basically easy to imitate, or that cannot be sustained, can they create less of an advantage? And then on the side of the weaknesses, can our competitors build a competitive advantage against us because we're weak in a particular area? Weaknesses must be evaluated in terms of importance in the particular service area. Even though we basically are working in a particular area, we must ask if these factors are important in creating competitive advantage for others. Therefore, the weakness is the weakness valuable in the particular service area, and is it rare amongst competitors? If it's valuable but not rare, difficult to imitate, and easy to sustain, we may have a significant competitive disadvantage. So these are all very critical factors to consider, very important to really look at these checklists that we have provided in terms of determining competitive advantage, determining competitive disadvantage. And by all means, I welcome any questions you might have as you go through the readings, as you go through the additional materials, as you review it. Any questions that you have are always welcome. And certainly one of the things I advocate, particularly in this segment, is asking a lot of questions, because that is the only way you will be able to clarify certainly anything that you do not understand in these two chapters. Thank you very much again. God bless you, and looking forward to greater engagement as we continue throughout this course.